Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to the Sonias for the invitation. And I can say this on behalf of all colleagues in the panel, all co-panelists, for bringing us together to the Belgrade Security Forum 2019 to discuss the issues which we would really like to say might be of crucial importance for the years to come. And thank you for your interest here. I just discuss briefly with colleagues who are in the panel. We would like to discuss with you, firstly, more general, how do we see engagement of women in political as well as economic life in the region? What are the experiences that we may share, and how can we compare with each other? As we are bringing different experiences. Valeshka is coming from Aspen, which is very much and very well known to people who've gathered here in the Belgrade Security Forum. While Molly Montgomery, she served in the State Department. She can share with us experience from Afghanistan, working on Afghanistan, working in Afghanistan as well, and is currently engaged by Albright Associates. And I was happy to work with Ms. Albright while I was in the office, and she was in the office briefly though, and then with the others. Thank you very much for joining us, Valeshka, Molly Montgomery. Igor Fedyuk is coming from Ukraine, from an NGO which is dealing with it's a Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament, so with hard security issues, so to say, and we are very happy to have a Ukrainian here to also discuss the experiences there. And old friend Despina Siri coming from Greece. She used to work with me in the Regional Cooperation Council for years back. She was also helping mayor of Thessaloniki, very well known then and very respected one then, assisting him as well. She has a lot of experience of working with refugees and their families coming to Greece, and was also teaching at universities, working with the UN entities as well. So we're going to be happy to hear about her experiences. What I wanted to say as a kind of a kick off. I'll be personal here, Sonia knows. Only more than a year back, my daughter, actually, she did her master thesis on women CEOs in Serbia. So she interviewed 23 women in Serbia who are CEOs of different companies, mainly in the banking sector, in IT sector, in other sectors as well. She talked to them, asked them several questions, and I read all she has done as a good father. And I learned a lot, because this was all about their lives. How did they get to this moment that they can say, now I'm CEO? What did they have to do? Whether there were compromises they had to make, whether they were intimidated in the process, what they can share with young women coming who are now striving to achieve their goals in businesses. What do they expect from the government? New laws, new attitudes, and interesting enough, I've learned one among different things, but one very particular was while being asked whether they are supportive for quotas or not. Sonia, out of 23, one said yes for quotas. I do, of course, have an understanding why is it so, because they fight their life to get there. And it goes the same way when it comes to political engagement. There is not much difference being a woman in business or being a woman in political life. And when they finally get to that point, if you mention to them quotas, then they feel as if you are undermining what they have personally achieved. This is why only out of 23 interviews, one has said, yes, I am in favor. Frankly, I would like to add my voice to that, and I would like to start this conversation with this, because I think it's hugely important still. And it is Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence and many other NGOs in Serbia who have really tried to voice this position in political life in Serbia as well as in the region, how important it is to have more women in offices, in the parliament. We've been working on quotas in the parliament. Well, we may discuss results today. We've been working as well on more of an engagement of women in political life. But in the second part of today's discussion, I'm going to invite co-panelists to really share their experiences coming from different areas of the world and with different backgrounds, to tell us also what more we can do when it comes to bringing women in the Balkans, sharing these experiences as well, which we may learn from. How can we engage them more on long-term processes, outstanding issues currently, all the dialogues been mentioned today, Belgrade, Pristina, our functionality of Bosnia and Herzegovina, our regional cooperation, our regional economic area. How can we get more of an engagement of women on peace, long-term and durable peace? Valeshka, I'd like to start with you. Look, we do see Germany as a key player in the EU, as a role model when it comes to economic and social issues as well. As I said, we've been analyzing what is happening here, to what extent we've got more women in political life, more powerful, decisive, and I was quite often mentioning an example of glass ceiling, that it is one of the issues. We do see women in offices, but there are two things happening. One, which I attribute to glass ceiling, there are certain limits. We cannot imagine them above this role. It looks like they are there, but not. And another one, we do see them in an executive position, but we know she's not the one deciding. It happens in businesses. It happens in politics. Somehow we've been mentioning already Germany as an example of, well, there we know she's the one deciding. And referring, of course, Chancellor Merkel. And there is no glass ceiling. So this is how we believe is the situation in Germany. Is it so? So Valeshka and her experience as one heading the Aspen Institute in Europe and in the Balkans. Please.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. I'm afraid I'll have to pour a bit of water in the wine when it comes to Germany serving as a prime example for women participation. Yes, we have a female chancellor, and yes, she's certainly the one with a lot of political influence. But if we look at the parliament, for example, there is a different story. So if we compare national parliaments in the Balkans, all countries have quotas of 30% for their parliaments, North Macedonia even 40%, and most countries are matching those quotas. It's only Bosnia and Herzegovina with 20% and Montenegro with 23% not matching those quotas. In Germany, we don't have a quota for a share of women in parliament. We only have voluntary quotas in some of the political parties that are supposed to strengthen women participation in Bundestag. But our current parliament only has a share of 31% women in the entire parliament, which is lower than in Serbia even, and which is the lowest share of women in the Bundestag in 20 years. So we've actually had a backsliding when it comes to women participation. When you look at the cabinets, it's a bit different. The cabinets here in the region, there's only Albania, which has more women in the cabinet than men. In Germany, this is relatively balanced. But Germany is also not doing so well in the EU comparison. There are several EU member states with female MPs that have a share of well over 40% in their parliaments. European Parliament as well has 40% women. So I think, first of all, I don't think Germany is the prime example when it comes to women participation. But I don't think it's enough, and this is also what you were referring to, Goran, to just look at the numbers. And here, in my opinion, a big challenge that women in parliaments is facing is the weakness of parliaments itself, but also the lack of internal party democracy. Because in the end of the day, internal party democracy leads to a situation in which women even have a chance to raise their issues and to get their voices heard once they are elected. And here, party politics are very much shaped by the leadership. And if we look at party leadership, and I did for this panel, I couldn't find a single political party in all Western Balkan countries which is present in the national parliament which is headed by a woman, not a single one. This obviously is a very different picture in Germany, not only when it comes to the leadership, but also internal party democracy. A positive trend that I'm seeing in Germany is that the public has started to react. So once the numbers became clear for our current parliament, there was a lot of public debate on why the numbers are so low in Bundestag. There was mainstream media criticizing this a lot, and we can see at the moment that several parties who have not discussed quotas before for their electoral lists are starting to do so. Or we have an increasing number of party leaderships, both on the national level but also on the federal state level, which are at least looking at double heads, for example, for the parties, and which are actively working now to increase women. And I think this public awareness and this public discourse is something that's still a bit lacking here when you look at the mainstream media.
Oleshka, you mentioned an example of Albania, which is a positive one. You just mentioned that there are more women in the government than men. But then we know who calls the shots. This is what I meant while saying glass ceiling in politics. Yes, they are there, but to what extent they engage? So, first of all, I like to praise this fact that there are more women in the government than men. The second one is, let's put an effort in bringing them to the top, so that we all are aware that we do have a different vibe coming from the government, not only because of the figures, but because, yes, it is the one who is deciding. And this is why did I mention Chancellor Merkel. So, besides this, what you've said about Germany, is there anything that Aspen Institute was doing in bringing more of women in executive roles, in political life, in any of the parts of the world you've been engaged? What is the experience of the Aspen Institute there?
It's not really part of our profile to actually actively work on gender issues. We face them ourselves, to be honest. We pay a lot of attention of having equally balanced panels. We're working on getting more women attracted to join our boards, etc. But we are facing also some of the challenges there. So no, I can say that we have been working actively on this.
I'd like to ask a different side of this panel, Despina Siri coming from Greece. Despina, we have just heard about the figures in some of the countries from the region as well as the real situation from a German. So now we'd like to hear similar things from a Greek. What is the situation?
Well, just recently, I think 2 days ago, the Gender Equality Index for 2019 has been published. And Greece abominably stands in the last position for the EU member states, having scored about 52% when the average in the European Union is 67 out of the 100 points. So there is huge gaps existing between women and men in 6 core domains. Work. In formal employment, there is only 31% women. Money. Women have a very poor access in financing. So, for example, that affects very much their opportunity to own a flat. Knowledge. University education. Postgraduate degrees, PhDs. There has been an improvement, 8% since 2017, but it's still lagging very much behind. Time. Women in Greece are overworked. They have no free time whatsoever. They have no time for their own well-being, no time for family, apart from doing jobs, no time for being themselves. Power. Government. I assume we will be talking about this later. Health. They are suffering from most health diseases much more than men. And mortality slightly, and this is against the universal average, is about the same with men. So legal and institutional framework is in place, yet implementation is severely poor. There is a persistence of discrimination, and there is the lingering impacts of the crisis and the austerity measures. Why do I mention the austerity measures? Because they meant loss of jobs for women or women doing very precarious jobs, which have no social security and have no job security. And this makes them far more vulnerable to poverty, especially women from marginalized groups such as Roma women, since we've been working on Roma, and of course migrant women. But Greece also has a unique opportunity at the moment to simultaneously strengthen its social and economic recovery, together with taking significant strides towards improving women's rights and prioritizing gender equality.
You mentioned balancing private and professional life. But I would actually invite all of you to go a step further into this. Is this one of the explanations? Because you also said in the same sentence that actually the legal framework is there, and that it is okay. Is it okay if at the same time you're saying that one of the problems why we don't have more women, either in businesses or in political life, in the executive positions, that this problem of balancing personal, private, and political life. So what more can be done? I guess there has to be more of an offer for them so that they go for it.
Absolutely, and you, with your legal background, knows best that the legal framework is not enough. Greece has actually gone backwards. In Greece, we had in 1887 the first magazine on women's rights. We had universal suffrage established in 1956, with women being elected in office. In 1975, after the dictatorship, we had the principle of equality enshrined in the Constitution. In the 80s, very progressive legislation, still very progressive in Europe, on abortion rights, on civil marriage, on outlawing discrimination in the labor market, and very importantly, abolishing the dowry system. In 2006, we had very good legislation on domestic violence, and in 2018, Greece was one of the first countries to ratify the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe against gender violence, with very binding legal standards. Not enough. And if you examine the institutions in Greece, for example, the parliament, after the recent elections in the summer, women make up 20% of the government. In the cabinet, out of 22 ministers, only 2 are women. And out of the 55 government members, only 5 are women. I would like to tell you a story which is very indicative in my view. Just after the elections, current Prime Minister, chose to give an interview to BBC Hard Talk, where he was asked about this very low participation of women in government, saying that there were not enough women elected in the parliament, so how could I have more ministers? And when there was a follow-up question in the Hard Talk, that, in your government of 55 members, you have 21 members that are not elected, they're experts, and your government is a technocratic government, so why not have more women there? His reply was, well, I approached some women, but they were very hesitant to take up positions of power.
But I guess this is an honest answer.
Well, which, allow me to say, does not really represent the true life in Greek society, where women are actually shouldering most of the work and participate in politics for many, many years, only kept, as you mentioned before, in low positions. It is very interesting to examine the local level, the municipal level, especially now that cities are becoming so important in the world and urban politics are getting so important. At the local level, the situation is not the same. We have many more women mayors, many more elected women in the municipal councils, and women that have positions of power. So women are good when it is to do local action plans, implement them, talk about neighborhoods, because they are good in cooperation, they are very good in building bridges, very important at the local level, yet this is not recognized at the national level.
Well, I'd like to raise another tricky issue, which is solidarity among women. It just happened to me. I was talking to a friend from one of the organizations I used to work with before, and she was complaining, today we are going to have a board meeting, and we all have to have these Tsiklama or pink T-shirts, as you know, it is a week or a month of fighting against the breast cancer. And the same day, I was given a call to a cousin of mine who's just been suffering an operation. So it turned out that, and it is happening to me quite often, I spoke to one very high-level official in one of the European settings, a woman dealing with human rights, who is talking, don't mention this gender issues to me, let's discuss human rights. So it happens to me quite often that there is a lack of solidarity among women who are in the executive positions to really introduce this gender element, or if it's introduced, for instance, I've just mentioned this, let's join forces together and say how important it is to all of us. Because these are the days, this is the month, October, when we all need to engage in raising our voices in support of women suffering breast cancer. And then women saying, come on, I'm busy with this or that. What can we do to engage more of a solidarity? And what are your experiences, Molly, as I know we're going to be discussing immediately with you real-life issues coming from Afghanistan and working with Afghani women?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks so much to the organizers for a great conference, and thank you for having this topic on the agenda, because it's really critical for the region to move forward, not just for women, but for the entire region. I'm glad you asked this question, because my boss, former Secretary of State, and the first woman Secretary of State in U.S. history, Madeleine Albright, has a great quote. It's supposedly attributed to her. She may not have actually said it, but that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. Certainly I think what we often have seen is that women who really were trailblazers, didn't feel comfortable talking about gender issues because they were too busy working twice as hard, fighting with everything they had just to be at the same table as men. So they didn't feel like they were able to, in addition to that, say, and also all of these other women, because they were so busy fighting, for their own spot. I think that's changing. And I would say it's great for women to help other women, not just mentorship, but sponsorship, really bringing them along, giving them opportunities. But it's also critically important that men help women. So I'm really glad to see here, often we do these panels and they're at the end of the day, and you're speaking to an audience and it's 95% women. So I'm really glad, first of all, to have representation that's much more diverse than that here. So thank you to all of the men who showed up. And I would say, one of the things that I think represents a real change in the approach to gender is when you do start seeing male allies, male champions stepping forward and saying, this isn't just about women, this is about all of society. What kind of society do we really want to be? Do we want to have, equal participation from all kinds of different groups, including, women who often represent more than half of the population? Because if we're not bringing women along, if women aren't equal, we're missing out. And one of the things that's been fascinating in the U.S., where I'm from, has been really to see this change over the last I would say 5 to 10 years. I was very struck last summer when you had the Women's World Cup happening, that for the first time in my life I saw dads and their sons walking around with women's soccer jerseys on. Made for men, they weren't women's cut, but a woman's name and number on the back. That was remarkable. That, I think, a few years ago would have been unthinkable in the United States, that you would have men saying, this is my hero, this is the person I look up to, this really strong, powerful woman. we also have seen, we have a president, as you all know, who has said some very well-known things about women and has a well-known history. But as a result of that, we have seen, several years running in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands of women and male champions coming out, to say this isn't okay and women need a seat at the table and an equal voice. So I think that's when you start to really see things change. When you see, we'll talk a lot about political empowerment today, but when you see political empowerment alongside economic empowerment and critically alongside changing norms around gender, in the culture, and that's where you really get sort of a virtuous circle where you really see long-lasting, self-reinforcing change. Sorry, that's not on the question of Afghan women. I am also happy to talk about that, and maybe I'll just start with a couple of points, and then we can come back to it later in the conversation. But, I think there's some important similarities in terms of the experience that Afghan women have had with a lot of women in the region. One is just the experience, of trauma. And I think in that case, it's, even more important for women to have a seat at the table and be supported, particularly when it comes to peace. And we'll get into this more later. Sure.
Real issues.
But women do have in conflict, a unique experience, and unfortunately, as we saw, here in the region in the 90s, as Afghan women saw over decades of civil war, there is sexual trauma, there are missed opportunities, there's a society that when you have violence tends to play up masculine traits that result in, further oppressing women. You have, in both cases, women who had achieved more and then have seen backsliding. And that experience of, obviously more dramatic in Afghanistan, where women couldn't even go to school, couldn't leave the home without a male chaperone. Obviously that was more severe. But, in these cases where you have women who, as a result of conflict, have actually seen their places in society be, diminished, become smaller, and those opportunities shrink, there's an even greater need for them to be brought to the table. In Afghanistan, women have made amazing progress and have come to the table as part of the peace process. So starting from the peace jirga that was held, over a decade ago, to being 15% or so. The percentage isn't great, but they are there. Part of the High Peace Council, which is sort of the advisory body on peace negotiations, to participating in Track 2 dialogues with the Taliban, and to, having grassroots efforts such as signature drives that collected, I think, 300,000 signatures in 2014 to end the conflict. We've seen, women demanding a seat at the table. And I think that's an important...
Could you say a word on the influence they have achieved? Mm-hmm. To what extent they have really influenced the process, and what was this qualitative change, having them around the table and engaged in the dialogue? Yeah,
I would say, unfortunately, there hasn't been as much influence as I would like to see. But one of the things they did achieve was, at least up until the last couple of years, a commitment by the Afghan government and by the entire international community to say that respect for the Constitution, including protections for women and girls, was a 100% precursor to any peace agreement. Mm-hmm. So that, women couldn't just be sort of traded away. That wasn't an acceptable trade-off that the new Afghanistan was willing to make. That, unfortunately, seems to have broken down over the last year with the recent negotiations, but I think that's an important point. The other thing is, just that mainstreaming, which we'll talk about a lot, has happened in that peace process to a certain extent, not enough. but that women's voices are part of the process. So you don't always know exactly what that means, but you have women who are able to provide that unique perspective and who are able, because of that seat at the table, to have some influence at least.
I have a very tricky question for you, Igor. I didn't want to tell you before. I'm not asking you to take any political sides or to give it a political color. But you did have, as Ukrainian, an experience of a powerful woman on the top. And I'm referring to Yulia. I'm asking you not what is her political legacy. I'm asking you whether there is a legacy in this context that we are discussing. Was she an encouragement for young Ukrainian girls and women to go for it, both in political arena as well as in the business arena? Was there this kind of a legacy?
Excuse me, who?
Was there this kind of a legacy of Yulia Tymoshenko? I'm not asking you political legacy. Therefore, I've said it's a tricky one. I'm not asking you to comment on political things. But really, having her there, was there this, what we would expect to happen, more of encouragement for young women to raise their voices in different fora and to be more engaged?
Thank you very much for the question. First, I would like to thank for the given opportunity to take part in this event and be the part of such a beautiful company. Well, I wouldn't like to talk about Yulia Tymoshenko.
I'm saying no political
as some kind of a role model for the women in Ukraine, because we had another driver that changed the situation drastically.
Okay.
And that was the Euromaidan.
Okay.
It was the revolution of dignity. So that was the main driver for the crucial changes in the Ukrainian society that changed the attitude toward women.
Well,
because
this is a very interesting thing that you're saying. Not necessarily a woman in a powerful position,
no,
but a political process as such, a dramatic moment in political life of a country which broadened an area for understanding of the role of the women. Is that what you're saying?
I would say the ordinary women were let's say, the driver for the drastic changes in the attitude toward women in Ukraine. Not the political figures like Yulia Tymoshenko, ordinary women. When they were the part of Maidan, it's about 45% of participants of the Euromaidan were women.
Okay.
After that, during the Maidan, they created the so-called these hundreds of self-defense women. And then these women, part of them, they engaged in the combat in the east. Some started the NGOs who supported the military troops, the Ukrainian army in the east. They gave the different, and they still are giving the different assistance to the Ukrainian army in the east in the conflict with Russia by different means.
Tell us about.
There's an example. There's NGO, women's NGO. That NGO that is led by women who supports the armed forces of Ukraine with the air reconnaissance. So the woman is leading the NGO that is teaching the operators for these drones for the army. So, and I would say this coming back to Euromaidan, that Euromaidan, the role of women, the women showed themselves, the ordinary women, the role of women in the Ukrainian society can be much more important than it was before. Because we know that the 70 years of the Soviet history, so it created a phenomena called the Soviet man. I mean, Советский человек, like a Soviet man in general. And it was the Soviet woman. According to the
but you just
Soviet
said
system.
Советский человек, and not sovietski muzhik.
No, человек, советский человек. And the women, actually, in the USSR, it was declared that women have all the rights. And you could see, you could see the women, the tractor driver, or the women somewhere in the mines, or the women street cleaner. Also, women could be the part of the Communist Party. Yes, but women never held the leading positions in the party.
So, but then tell us, what happened? What was the driver to unleash the potential of women in the society then?
The women participation in Euromaidan. So it was the driver for them to enter more politics, to where they could, after entering the politics, they could defend the rights and promote more women in the politics and in the security sector. Because after the Euromaidan, in 2016, the national plan for implementing the UN's Security Council Resolution 1325. So it was implemented, and such women, they promoted the more participation of women in the government, in the parliament. We also have in Ukraine the 30% quota, and those parties who obey this quota, they have the 10% funding, state funding, in the end. Also, the result of that was the changes in the law, the legal system regarding the possibility for women to take part more widely in the security system, in the armed forces, in police, in the National Guard. So the more positions for women were opened. Mm-hmm. So and the quantity of the armed forces increased in the recent years. In last year, and for 2000, and today we have around 27,000 women in the armed forces, mm-hmm. which is 10% of the total personnel of the armed forces in Ukraine. And comparing to NATO, it's
this discussion is getting tricky, and I'm actually happy. I like tricky debates, and I'm going to provoke further. Molly, you have mentioned something that we are all aware of, but it has to be mentioned each time, and I support you there. Women as the victims in conflicts. This was happening all over this area, in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Kosovo, all over. And we want really to offer support to them, to offer an understanding for what they've been suffering through, and justice for them. But we also want them to be heard. We want them to be part of the peace process currently and in the future. But you were mentioning, Igor, something, and this is women supporting our guys. Now I'm deliberately going a step further, being part of the forces, training or teaching our troops, or being part of the troops. So I'd like to invite both of you, as well as, of course, others in the panel, as well as the audience, to go a step further. I really honestly hope that there will be a real, stable, sustainable peace in Ukraine soon. There is sustainable peace here, and I'm happy to say. But we are far from really reaching a point in which we really have a full understanding for what has happened, and that we really go several levels up from where we are now. We're discussing regional economic area in the Balkans. We are discussing this morning outstanding issues. We've discussed the dialogue on Belgrade-Pristina. We are discussing the functionality of Bosnia and Herzegovina as two outstanding issues. We are discussing the European perspective of the region. And now we need to be supported. And I believe we can have a real engagement of women in the Balkans. Therefore, I'd like to ask all of you to pick up your experiences and how can we go from where we are into this at least one level up of real substantial engagement of women in decision-making processes. So on the long run, to really be able to say, well, this is a really peaceful and Europeanized, whatever it means technically, Balkans. So this step further is what I'd like to ask. We have enough time to discuss, as well as there is time for the audience as well. There will be room for questions, trust me. Who wants to start with this? Because this is a step up from what we have. We can discuss women as victims, and this is drama. We can discuss what you've started, women as really being part of the society, defending the society. But now going into the peace engagement. Despina, you wanted to say a word, please.
Well, I think that it is not either or.
Okay, super.
It's a much more complex, much more nuanced situation. For example, if we take Sudan, to go away from Southeast Europe, the Balkans. In Sudan in April we had mass demonstrations, first for bread and then for democracy. 2/3 of the demonstrators were women. That led to the ousting of the autarchic dictator al-Bashir. In July, we had a paramilitary group attacking the demonstrators, where about 150, this is doctors' reports, it's not verified data, about 150 people were killed and about 100 women were raped. So you see the fatality rates. Killing and rape goes together in almost the same numbers. And then in August, women persisted. So this is a movement for political and social change. Women persisted, and you had an accommodated settlement, a negotiated agreement for an interim government to lead to elections, where the Minister of Foreign Affairs is a woman. That in Sudan is really something. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take, and what I'm examining an African country because I want to stress the situation in Africa, where conflicts are alive, whereas our memories from the Balkan conflicts are sometimes frozen and we interpret them the way we want. We mentioned the list of countries with more ministers. Actually, Bulgaria is the first and Slovenia is the sixth, which is an optimistic note I wanted to underline here.
For the wider Southeastern
And
Europe.
Albania is the 10th there,
Okay,
in the global ranking.
Uh-huh.
But 4 African countries are amongst the 10. This is huge, really huge. And it shows that in countries, in states, where processes are very lively, are unfolding rapidly and violently, women are there. There is not this time lag to formulate legal frameworks, institutional frameworks, policies, national plans, national strategies, implement. So things are unfolding in the way real life and society works. And nobody can doubt women's involvement in real life. I would like to mention not a peace operation, but my recent experience in humanitarian operations with refugees and migrants in Greece. Now, I assume you've all read about the terrible, inhuman, degrading conditions in the hotspots. So the detention camps on the Greek island and the refugee camps in the mainland of Greece, which is the only EU member state that has such facilities, with the agreement of the European Commission and the then Greek government. The situation is, for women, is taken to extreme levels of vulnerability and precarity. Women in Moria and in Samos cannot exit their shabby tents in the night because they will get raped. So they wear diapers not to have to go to the toilet. Women, though, are raped every day. So are children, and not only, girls and boys. So what I'm trying to say is that in conditions, and this is where Molly can come back, of extreme breaking of the social fabric, of extreme violence, then, of course, gender is super important in defining precarity. What was the international community response in Greece? 2015, 2016. In 2017, SGBV, sexual-based violence, gender interventions, were prioritized with the UN agencies, the international funding, the European funding, for a year. Only for a year, maybe a year and a half. It has stopped since the beginning of 2018. How much an intervention that is project-driven, sponsor-driven, limited time, how can it influence anything on real life as more and more flows of refugees and migrants, very mixed flows, keep arriving?
But what would be your advice, Despina? What would be the right policy to implement and engagement?
On the side of the international community,
Yeah.
multilateral organization and governments, a gender lens and mainstreaming gender in all the policy decisions that they take.
Okay.
For example, on education, the Greek government took the decision since 2016 to have all refugee children attending regular schools, taking the steps to do that. Yet we had international schemes of funding calling for and actually implementing within the refugee camps separate schools for girls and boys, supposedly to strengthen girls' participation to schools. But that sent the totally wrong message in populations that came to live in the European Union or in Europe in general. Education here is compulsory and is mixed. Mm-hmm. This is our norms and values, and when these were short-term projects of, this is not Afghanistan, we are talking Greece, we are talking refugee camps in Greece. These children were going to school, to normal mixed school in the morning, and the new arrivals, and in the afternoon they had to do non-formal education separately, segregated. Why? But there's two things I wanted to draw from this humanitarian experience. Mm-hmm. The one is that when there are refugee women involved, then you get the community perspective mm-hmm. into how interventions can be planned, how mm-hmm. plans can be made, how even localized measures can be taken. And the community perspective is very important. We in the West tend to prioritize individual decisions, yet it's not always like that. Cultural norms that Molly spoke about are very important. Masculinities are very important. Working with boys as well, and working on what it means to be a man is equally important as working with girls and talking about women. So, and I would say this is true for our Balkan societies, because my personal view is the main problem or issue to be addressed in our societies is everyday sexism, our patriarchal families that are still very much prevalent there. And where you see women playing a very important role is in the diaspora migrant communities in women, where they function well, where they are integrated in society. Some cases Germany, some cases Netherlands, not everywhere, but when they work well, they do produce results.
Molly, you wanted to jump into this, and in a way you were invited. Please.
Well, first of all, I agree with a lot of what Despina has said, and I think it's critically important to think about the gendered lens and, as you say, the community lens as well, and the role of men and how we define gender plays a huge role in sort of the opportunities and the successes that both women and men can have. I want to just step back a tiny bit and talk about all of these laws and plans on the books that Despina mentioned, because it is true. I think that when you have a society where organization is breaking down, women are often more targeted, but there also are often opportunities to make large strides. But as I thought about my experience living in the region in Bosnia, and then what I read about the situation with respect to gender, it really struck me that the situation on paper looks better than it really is. Because if you look at all of the, gender indices and rankings, actually the region looks pretty good. It's a little bit below most EU member states, but kind of above most developing countries. But I think that really, it's an illustration of the fact that the region has been good at doing a lot of box checking over the last couple of decades. Some of that, I think, has certainly come from the international community. Some of it, is part of EU accession requirements. But, when you have the national action plans in place for UNSCR 1325 implementation. You have, I was shocked to learn, the first gender equality law in Bosnia was passed in 2003. You have all of these laws on the books, but they've never been implemented. Or, as you were saying, when you do have women in positions of quote unquote power, in fact they're often treated more as tokens or as window dressing. And so, the question really is, how do we go from it looking good on the surface or okay on the surface to really moving forward with progress that is tangible and where women feel a difference. And that's where I think mainstreaming really has to come in, because this isn't just about, okay, once a year, because it's October, we do women things. This has to be sort of a daily, process of looking at every, policy debate, all of these decision-making processes, from a gendered lens. And only when that becomes fully integrated will we actually start to see real progress.
Igor, I'd like to invite you, to give you more of a room into this debate, also to continue on this discussion. How do we bring women into a peace process? Because it will also come there as it is here. Please.
Yeah, but they are there.
Okay.
So, but what we need, what first women need, to be in the position that more closer to the decision making in this process, and the challenge. So the ways to achieve that goal, they are different, and I'm not sure that we'll invent a bicycle here once again. So all these ways, they are well known. But the main challenge, as for me, is to make all these things work. So we have to. Okay, one of the ways is to change the legal basis, so it helps to promote women to be more engaged in all these processes. There is the changing of the legal basis, but not every time it is fulfilled. So the challenge is to make these things that are changed work. And the same situation on the other things. Simultaneously, there have to be work, as I agree totally with Despina, there have to be work with men also, with boys, starting from
education.
From education. So all these things, all the aspects related to women, to their more important role in the society, they have to be included in the educational programs. They have to be, change the thinking of the society, also at home, within the families. So this is the challenge, how to do that. And I'm more than convinced that, also referred to what you said in the beginning, there's the less of unity of women. So there have to be more solidarity between the women. So I would compare this to some kind of a protest. If there is stable, constant protest, so it gets some results in the end. So if the stable unity of women in this process, they are defending their rights on different level, on starting from the civil society, government, interconnection between them, and if this is stable, so there will be the results.
I have again tricky question for you, Valeshka, but for the audience as well. I'd like to simply acknowledge that we are also supported here by Brankica Jankovic, who is in Serbia an ombudsman for equality. Therefore, I expect that you will be engaged. I see others also interested in questions, and there will be Q&A now in a minute. But a tricky question for you. What is more important, to have a law on quotas or to have laws which will provide more of a house care, sensitivity for employed women, equality of wages, more of a support at home in order to balance the private and professional life? What is the target really? I mean, I guess both, but in real life, how do we get there? Because it's not only about quotas, it is also providing a room for a woman to use quotas, to feel safe, to feel that she can balance everything in her life and therefore go for an executive position. So where would you go? What do you think is a real answer?
I would say there is no either or. I personally haven't been a fan of quotas myself, but thinking about this issue more broadly, I think for the beginning they do make sense, because I think what we need is not only laws on quotas and issues like that, but we need structural changes as well. You were talking about, for example, childcare. It's an important issue, and it's one where Germany is failing, by the way, very much as well. And there are more structural challenges than that. I think it's also a matter of societal perceptions, and we were talking about this earlier. It needs to become normal for women to be at the table, and I think quotas are a way of getting there, because I don't think that a group of men will sit together and think about the structural challenges women face when trying to reconcile work and a private life. So for me, I consider quotas as kind of an intermediate step to creating a new normal in that sense. And when it comes to societal perceptions, I was reading a bit in preparation for this panel. I came across a study. This is now referring to the economic sector, but we haven't really talked about that yet either. There was a study done by a German institute on the impact of female superiors on the happiness of the workers, and they did an anonymous study. Where they had like an equal share of men and women in that study, and they got a task. And about at halftime through that task, they got criticism in writing, but partially by men and partially by women. And the study revealed that 70% of this study group was less happy with the task that they were given when they were criticized by a woman. That not only means that men have a problem with female superior, that also means women do too. And I'm mentioning this because it struck me, because it reveals a lot about the perceptions in society. And I don't think we will ever change those perceptions and those expectations also if we don't make it the new normal. And you were asking about Ukraine and Julia earlier in shaping perceptions. I think when it comes to that, our Chancellor has done a lot when it comes to this. I see how the public discourse is changing. I mentioned this earlier when it comes to the reactions to the low levels of women in Bundestag. We have the same debate when it comes to the business sector. We have a new law, or not new, it's actually 4 years old already, that required the biggest 100 companies in Germany to have at least a share of 30% women in their supervisory board. They are matching that, but all other smaller companies are not. And actually in the executive boards, the share of women is in decline. Why is that? So I think there is still a long way to go, and I think quotas are an intermediate step of getting there to creating this normalcy.
I'll give you several names now, and I think you know each and every one, if I'm not wrong, or almost each and every one. Edita Tahiri, you met. Vjosa Osmani, she's coming, but we'll meet her soon, I guess. Ana Brnabić, Brankica is sitting over there. Gordana Čomić, you know, I believe. Nataša Vučković, you know, MPs for 10 years or more in Serbian parliament. Vesna Pusić, she was a star yesterday and today. Tanja Fajon. I don't know whether you met minister in the Council of Ministers of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Borovnica, I think Senida or so. She's the one dealing with human rights and etc. I mean, can you imagine bringing these women together in the Balkans? I mean, I can. This is why I'm raising this question. You know, and then really try to let them talk difficult issues, hard talk. Can we do that? I mean, I know Sonia was working very hard on bringing MPs from the region. But this kind of a group of women who have decade-long experience in politics, hard politics, and can talk to each other, I'm absolutely positive for each and every one. Every name that I mentioned here can sit and talk. What more could be done would be an issue for them to discuss. How can they influence the processes? I believe that they will be more sensitive on education. And I was only a month back in Kosovo, talked to one person, I'm sorry if I cannot remember her name. She has done her studies in UCL, London, and got back and started an NGO dealing only with children, because she told me, look, I realized that what is a real issue in Kosovo is education, not high school education, but really starting with those who are in elementary school. Focusing with all her knowledge coming from UK, I want to work with them. So I'm using this as an example to say this different approach to the problems in society, which I think is a gender-colored. And I'd like to have it more in difficult processes. This is why I think if we can have these women around the table discussing behind the closed door or in the open fora their approaches. We might have more of a focus on education, on political sensitivity, including a gender sensitivity, while discussing difficult issues. Understanding where are the others, what would they expect. So this is what I would like to see happening. Now I'd like to use the time, we have enough time. Please, the floor is open. One, or we'll start with you, because you were the first one. Please. I'm happy that you're all interested and grateful to each and every one. We have half an hour. Briefly introduce yourself, go for a question or a comment, but then tell us.
Hi, I'm Ona Haidari. I'm a journalist. One topic that wasn't broached at all today is the fact that so many nationalist and conservative governments in the region and wider, such as Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Poland, have increased their efforts, so the rhetoric, but also the financing of programs that would increase stop demographic decline in these countries, which places undue pressure on women to have more kids. This inadvertently then leads to them not being able to assume positions of power, but also affects the rhetoric in these countries. Women are there to have more kids so that their role is to keep our ethnic group alive and in large numbers. And how is that sort of going to affect women being in power in the future in the next 10 years or 5 or 10 years in the region and wider?
Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer that question myself. So there was someone who wanted to ask a question, please. Okay, yes.
I'm a student of security studies at the University of Belgrade, and I just wanted to ask, since United Nations are bringing so many resolutions about including women, like 1325 and 1880 and etc., is that actually going to change something, or is it more like a show for public to say we tried but we didn't do anything?
Please.
I'll stand up. Good afternoon. Thank you for a very intellectually stimulating panel. My name is Andrea Marinkovic. I'm currently with the OSCE I have a question which might be actually directed to Ms. Montgomery the most, because you mentioned gender mainstreaming, and I've had the opportunity to work on it a couple of times within international organizations. But what I found is that even when we gender mainstream, we still have gender biases. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take an example of security studies, and we've seen a massive rise in female suicide bombers. And this is also seen as women who have been coerced into doing this. However, interviews have discovered that actually a lot of women decide to become martyrs themselves for their own reasons. Yet we still don't take them seriously. We still see this as them being coerced, their agency being taken away. How do we mainstream gender without actually having gender biases of women being not being aggressive, being caretakers, being nurturers? How do we move away from that and actually just simply use gender as a lens in our research and also policymaking, because it affects us all? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Brankica, please.
Brankica Janković, Commissioner for Protection of Equality of the Republic of Serbia. My question is for all panelists who wants to answer. How to face with a new phenomena, let's say new trends, very sensitive, very sophisticated way of marginalization of women. 2 weeks ago, I presented my annual report for our parliament, and almost all MPs who discuss about the report, which contained position of a woman, young people, elderly people, LGBTI community, people with disability, national minorities, all groups of our population. Almost all MPs who discuss about that were women. And some of them ask me, Commissioner, please, can you make your discussion much shorter? Because tomorrow morning we have very good, we have very important session about budget, and of course, when men decided to discuss, they always speak about essential issue: budget, finance, security, Kosovo, etc., because they think that is the essential, this is the very, very important, that other issues are not important, and they will give to women to speak about that unimportant issue. And all my colleagues in our region, equality institutions, face the same problem. Only women discuss. And I'm very happy because in this call we can say many men finally, because it's very important to motivate men to speak about what is essential. Kosovo, it is question how many decades we talk about that. But what's wrong with us? And if we have enough time, the second question for Goran and Mr. Igor. Do you have enough solidarity between men? And do we only women face with lack of solidarity? Thank you.
Well, I'll start, as I promised, I'll misuse my powers here, and we'll try to offer an answer to. You've actually raised an issue which I find perhaps one of the most difficult, most important issues related to development in this country and all neighboring countries, and this is the depopulation. I think the depopulation might be more of a problem than we believe. But I wouldn't put it in the context of women invited to give birth to children. I put it in more complex context, and this is that, yes, fertility rate versus fertility versus mortality, well, there are more people who die every year than who are born, but the real figure is becoming dramatic because of the people leaving the country. Girls and boys. Therefore, I just want to say, the depopulation is a huge issue. I'm happy to have your input, so therefore, just please use a micro.
I feel that the governments are sending the wrong message. If there's economic stimuli in Poland, we saw this affected the recent elections. If there's economic stimuli given to women or families who have more kids. Mm-hmm. I've spoken to people in Poland who've said, we decided to, I mean, it isn't a lot of money, but we decided to have more kids because we knew we would get support from the government. And if you do that to women, that diminishes their freedom to make decisions about their future and their role in society and take up positions
This is why
of power.
deliberately...
So I'm not talking about
no,
like...
No, I'm twisting your question because I
Don't
wanted
twist
to
it,
say
'cause this is important.
the depopulation is a real issue, but the cure is not, well, just give more birth. Vesna, I'd like to have your input. Vesna Pucci, please give her a micro.
Sorry.
I mentioned your names. I didn't
Thank
see
you.
it,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interfere.
Please do.
But because your question is relevant and actually all, I mean not all, but a lot of governments make this mistake, I wanted to paraphrase or tell you the research done by a Slovenian demographer who was following the state interventions into, let's say, demographics or into the issue of how many children people have by different state stimuli and she said, you know, everything the state gives, and this was for 40 years, everything the state gives is good to people who have children. It's good for the people who already have children, but it has zero influence on people's decisions to have children. And the only thing that she finds, and she showed a graph. She showed a graph.
What is the trigger? What
the
influences?
only thing, she says, that, and she showed it historically on this graph, is the atmosphere of optimism in a society. When you have periods of general optimism, something good happens or something bad ends, you all of a sudden have these surges. Everything else is good for people who already have children, but it doesn't make up people's minds.
So you're
to
basically
have
telling
more,
us that the
more
baby
children.
boom periods are coming as a result of either drama being completed and the horizon being open with more of an optimism and vigor in a society.
Exactly.
Rather than more money for second
More
children,
money
third
is
children.
good. More money is always good.
For
If
those
you
who do
give
have that.
people more money, it will make their lives easier with the kids, but it definitely won't decide.
I like to link what you've said with what I mentioned and then give the floor to my panel, would be fair. Why did I insist on depopulation as a more complex? It's not only about giving birth, but people who are living. Because, it happened to me in Sarajevo. I've spent 6 years in Sarajevo, and my secretary came to me saying, I'm leaving. I said, come on. You're paying 2,000 euros as a secretary, which is more than your minister in the government. You're 40-something. You are about to fight for having more of a role in this country. You should be. I would expect from you. You speak languages, German, absolutely fluent, English as well. And her answer was, Goran, I've just got a baby. 20 years back, when you were in the office, I believed after the Dayton, this is going to be something different. Now, 20 years later, I will never let my newborn son live in Bosnia for another 20 years and see all of this same thing happening. This is very much for down the lines of what Vesna has said. So the trigger for her to go is she's well enough, she can afford to live out. She's well integrated in her society, well integrated abroad, has enough of money. Now she's ready to go out to, I guess, Germany, Austria, whatever. And her message is, I'm fed up with all of you politicians, health system, education system, transport, I don't want. So she's above, not poverty line, she's well off compared to everybody in society. And therefore, she decided. So you might say she's arrogant bastard towards her society, but she's not. She simply believes she deserves more for herself, for her family, for her children. So this is what I think was, what is the problem in this part of the world. We believe we can achieve more, and we can have more, and therefore we are gone. So it is all about rule of law eventually. Therefore the EU is right. It's all about rule of law. The system, the way it functions. Therefore, this is also coming back to our real issues, and I now would like to give a floor to each and everyone. Molly, you were the first one asked, but please bear this in mind. What is really opening a door for more empowered women is related to the way the the society functions, the state, the administration, the everyday life function for her to go up. Not only the legislation related to women or men, but everything else. This is what I meant by asking Valeshka. So, Molly, please.
Yeah, I mean, so I think brain drain is certainly a problem. We're losing a lot of, both women and men, potential leaders and real contributors when you're losing 1% of your population a year. But on Una's question, I mean, so I think I would separate out the rhetoric from the policy. Because I come from a society, and this is where I have to admit that I come to these conversations with a great deal of humility. I come from a society where we have neither a law on quotas nor basic legal protections, or policies in place to support women, on maternity leave, childcare that's subsidized, and so I think there are a lot of women, including very well-educated professional women, who don't feel as though they are supported enough to be able to both have a career and have children. They're choosing actively to not have children because there is no support in place. That being said, so the policy is not the problem. Giving women the freedom economically to choose whether or not they want to have children, I would argue that's a really good thing. That being said, the rhetoric that says, women, your way to be patriotic is to bear children, is a huge problem. And that leads, as you get further down the spectrum of nationalism, that leads to some really troubling things. And then if you do get to the point of actually having conflict, then, as we all know, this leads to sort of women's bodies being considered territory that needs to be conquered, and how do you do that? It's with rape, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is how we get down, what can be a very slippery slope.
Valeshka.
I'm actually also very happy you asked that question, not because I think, for me personally, whether it has an effect of more children being born or not is not the most relevant part of that policy. For me, and this is a trend that I find very concerning, beyond those countries that you mentioned, I think it's a trend across Europe that national conservative parties or even right-wing populist parties as part of their program, have a very anti-gender, anti-equality discourse and program in general. So yeah, I would agree here completely with Molly. I think this is a major problem, that because it promotes old stereotypes rather than promoting a picture where women have an equal position at the table. And maybe just a thought on your question, because I can't say I really have an answer, but my impression increasingly is that gender issues are still seen as a problem of women, and I think many people fail to realize that it benefits society and the country per se. Just a few weeks ago, I read a World Bank report that basically said that if women were as active on the labor market as men in the Western Balkans, GDP could be 20% higher. So, and I think there are many examples for that, and I think still society fails to realize that it's not a woman issue, but that is something that concerns all of us.
Igor, do you have a reflection?
Totally agree with Valeshka.
Okay.
And I like to add that, and what I mentioned before, this is in the women's interest to promote all these things. So it's very tough question for you, and you should realize that men will not help you in this. So this is the
so
nature.
There is a solidarity among men.
But the things how they are going now. Uh-huh. So, but and when talking about the solidarity, for example, in Ukraine, so we can talk about solidarity now, but about 5 years before, we couldn't talk about that because and even nowadays we can talk about solidarity only during the let's say the hard times, like it was Euromaidan or war. But if the situation is more or less calm, so in such, and I compared the situation in Ukraine to the situation in the Western Balkans. So when the positive changes in the Western Balkans started after the war. After the wars, there was the national programs regarding the UN Security Council resolution were adopted, and all the positive changes after that. But now we see that we have the signs that things are not very good going here, and a clear example of that is the last year's. In March, there was the demonstration along the Baltic countries. So this how the things are going. And regarding the resolution 1325 and other resolutions of the UN Security Council, yes, they can work, but as I mentioned before, only when you oversee them, only when you control them. So if they just are implemented just to be implemented, they worth nothing.
I'd like to invite you, Despina, as well, to reflect on what's been mentioned. I'm sorry, Alexandra Miladinovic, if I'm not wrong. Andrea Maringo, apologies. But I was... sorry, apologies. But my reading is going to be brutal of what you've said. Are you telling us that the analysis of women suicide bombers, among other issues, one of lines is that if I cannot be equal to you, well, we discuss budget, money, family, education, I'll be equal by shooting myself and being shaheed, as they say in Bosnia. Is that what you are telling us? That because they are not equal in other areas of life, they've decided to go that far to be suicidal bombers?
I guess that can be a part, but what I was aiming at is that the agency of women is taken out of this equation as well. So even when things like women suicide bombers, and that is just an example, women have been part of terrorist groups and revolution groups for centuries. Yep. This is just something that is relatively new in research because we didn't think about women being aggressive before. And this is just the fact that women have their own grievances. Sometimes they might be different from men's. Like you said, women do not feel like they're being taken into consideration in society, and then they decide to become martyrs. But then women might have this exact same grievances as men in that society, which means that they will become terrorist fighters and female suicide bombers, not to refer to them as female suicide bombers, simply suicide bombers, because of the same reasons. But we do not take this into account in research. And again, going back to my question, why can we not mainstream gender with using gender simply as a lens, without the bias of the stereotypes we have about women and what they can be like and how they can behave and how much agency they have to make a decision? Because let's be real, women can be aggressive too, and it's important to have them at the peace negotiations table as well.
What you've said, as if I have said all of this, would have been misinterpreted, being a man and being a moderator of the debate. But actually, frankly, I do agree with you. So sometimes you go very far believing if we bring them, then the peace will come. Well, and not necessarily.
The same coin of this conversation is, when you come into a room and tell men we want more women to be engaged in peace negotiations, you have that argument that is constantly repeated, okay, but then why don't women serve the military? This is the same, except this also goes to our benefit. It goes to the benefit of policymakers, because women, and going back to the same example again, if they are suicide bombers, often their effect is far more detrimental because they often go unnoticed. Simply because they are women. People are not trained.
So the problems still are there.
Yeah, they exist. There was a Wafa Idris, I think, early 2000s, Palestinian, first female suicide bomber that was recorded in the new millennia. And her notebook said, I am a martyr, I am fighting for my cause. Whereas all of the research that looked into her described her as a victim that was manipulated by her brother, husband, that. She didn't have her agency, and women do, so.
Please, Molly.
So there's some research, that's come out recently looking at, at what ages do very young children perceive differences? So gender, race, that sort of thing. And what's terrifying about this is that it is so much earlier than we thought. We probably thought, well, if you get to them sort of by puberty, then you've really, then you have a chance at sort of promoting equality, et cetera. Elementary school. No, you have to start modeling equality and fighting these stereotypes at birth. Because by the time kids are 18 months old, they can perceive these differences, race, gender, etc. And by the time they're 3, they have fixed ideas that they use to reenact stereotypes with other children. So just let that sink in. That's terrifying. Because if we all agree that the problem, is that women's issues aren't just for women, and they aren't women's issues, they're societal issues, right? This is why we call it gender, not just women. That men do need to be in solidarity with women if we're ever going to have true equality. That, solidarity and talking and thinking about these issues can't just be for women. Then we have to start with a generation that's not even born yet. There are things, of course, we can do in the meantime, but it's a really good question and it's really tough, and I don't think we have all the answers for how to do this perfectly.
I'd like to invite panel, starting with Despina, to go for a closure, a minute or two, please.
Sure. I think this agonizing question assumes that research is something neutral, and it is not. Research is also very much driven by interest. And I think that going back to the basics and the 101 of political sociology, gender, which is different to sex, is important because it allows us to understand relations of power as they are socially constructed and as all these plays of power unfold within society. Therefore, I think this is the answer to the question about the emphasis that is given by certain governments, certain countries at the moment on reproduction as a duty and not as a right. The importance of demography. The importance of demography could be understood in a different way. Why are we so hostile to migration? And all the European narratives are about an invasion, when actually the numbers have dropped the last few years. When what I wear is made in Bangladesh, what I write with or what I eat is made by people who work for 20 cents a day, and obviously with mobiles and connectivity, they also want to share in this wonderful European dream of affluence and comfort zone that we have.
Yeah, there, I'm very much with you, Despina. Just a second. Yeah. We are discussing depopulation. We've been mentioning migration. You've been saying several things about. Well, it was a Romanian minister only 2 months back who went to, I think, Pakistan and signed a contract to bring in Romania 1 million of labor from this country, saying we. So it's neighboring country. We are missing 1.5, but at least if you can bring 1 million. Here, I'm going to have a meeting with the head of a Chamber of Commerce of Serbia, Marko Čadež, now, just after this panel, and I've spoken to him. He said, what is the problem with German companies coming in Serbia? He's saying labor. Qualified labor, and yes, what are we doing? Well, he's saying we are bringing foreigners in north of Serbia, Subotica, Novi Sad, where the investors are coming. We don't have them. Therefore, please understand, this is why I'm saying depopulation is a complex issue, and therefore, rightly so, you mentioned, perhaps we should shape differently our own attitude, including in Serbia.
Absolutely, and we are not discussing legal pathways for migration.
Towards migrants, who is engaged in picking fruits, so in harvesting season in Serbia. Well, Albanians from both Kosovo and Albania, Bulgarians, Romanians, though they are the EU member countries, but they are coming to work. So it's a seasonal labor. So the change is huge, and we should be open for this. Thank you for that. Yes, please.
But actually, it also reproduces, and that's very important for policy making, stereotypes, because very often policy making and planning works with stereotypes and biases, which are, it's very destructive for policy making because it's not evidence-based. And coming back to your, refusal to discuss gender issues because budget is so much more important. One of the things that I've learned at RCC, working at RCC, is the fact that you can't mainstream anything from Roma policies, from Roma issues to gender issues unless you also budget them on an annual basis and broken down with targets and always with data. And this is very often missing in gender policy making. What is also missing is curricula, training materials for our schools through a gender perspective. We learn this history of grand men, kings, generals, who slaughtered each other. We never learned the history of ordinary men and women. I will cut it there. One thing where I actually want to address your point about this grand debate where the important ladies of Balkan politics come together. I'm afraid it is too late for that.
So you see this more in prevention of conflicts rather than declaring the peace.
It would be very good if it happens, but it's not enough. It's not enough. Yesterday, Friends of Europe published a survey where countries of the Western Balkans were also surveyed. It's asking youth what is important for them. In this survey, it was blatantly clear that gender LGBTQI issues are far more important, twice as important for young generation than it was just for my generation before. This is the generations that are shaping the world. Voting ages go down, 17, even 16 in Austria. This is a new world, and I'm afraid we are trying to survive with very old tools.
Thank you. Igor, what Andrea was saying, was very much feeding into what you've started with. Women engage in training the soldiers, being with them, etc. But she was now making and shaping this in a very tricky manner. Anything you would like to comment on, or anything what you've heard from the audience? Please do. 55
seconds.
Please.
So, very few words just to summarize. I'm very optimistic in the future, in engagement in women in more government security and matters and peace and security matters. So it's the evolutionary process. So now we have the results, visible results. We have the quantitative aspect of the women in these spheres. So what we have to achieve next is the quality. So, and I think that these are the visible target for the future.
Thank you. Molly, Valeshka's going to be the last one.
So I'm going to have to disagree. I think there are a lot of quality women out there. I don't think they get the platforms they deserve. So I'll come back to saying thank you to the organizers for this conversation, for the fact that there's not just one conversation about women, but there's another event later this afternoon as well. Encourage all of you to attend that. But I think what's different about this generation, and I agree with you, Despina, is that this generation has put a gendered lens on already. And I think it's up to us to all do that as well, because I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic not because there's going to be top-down change, but because we all have the ability to change this in our own lives. And so I think that's what we all need to commit to doing.
Thank you, Molly. Valeshka, though we like and we love Washington, Berlin is closer to us, so you are the one.
I'm not going to make an effort to summarize everything that's been said. I just wanted to come back to just a few points that were mentioned. The generational point. The study that I mentioned earlier of responses of workers to female superiors' criticism actually includes a glimpse of hope, because the study group of people in their 20s actually made much less of a difference, close to no difference between male and female superiors' criticism. So for me also, this is a glimpse of hope that this is a generational shift, and that that things can change over time. And I wanted to come back to stereotypes, because I think this is something that's shaping every single one of us, some more, some less, and I think some also unconsciously. If you look at, for example, advertisement or marketing, and we were talking, you were mentioning children, how toys are marketed to children. They repeat the same gender stereotypes, so it starts very, very early on, and I think this is a major problem. And even, and I mean no offense by that, I'm sure it wasn't on purpose, but when you were talking about regional female politicians meeting and discussing topics, the topic you suggested was education, not economy, not security, it was education.
I was saying something different. Said that they will come and tell us what is needed is to change the curricula, etc. No, they discuss education.
I understand, but I'm saying is even when there's female political participation, very often it's specific portfolios that are designated. And I think, as I said, I think there are a lot of also subconscious stereotypes that shape these things, and I think it's very important. And I also would like to thank the organizers for putting this so high on the agenda here, because I think you can only overcome those even subconscious stereotypes and gender biases if it's more out in the open and more talked about.
You were right about this. I mean, I do have an experience. So if you have a minority representative in the government, you give him or her to be Minister of Human Rights, or I don't know, something like
family.
Less in family, Yeah, I fully agree with you, but that was not what I meant.
I know.
Bringing them together to discuss peace might end up in the group of these women who are heavyweights, each and every one in domestic politics, coming up with more complex advice to how to change the situation. Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy and grateful to all the co-panelists. Thank you very much. But I enjoy very much your questions, and I highly respect all what you've said. My answer to your question is, no. My answer to you is actually yes. Yes, men are. I'm sorry. I somehow have this feeling, and okay, I'll now talk to you. I believe, as you are the one in this society, and there is a group, you're not the only one, but who's been an ombudsperson here, you should be surrounded by a group of young women, girls. Because you mentioned, Molly, I think, about mentoring, training, advising. Yes, the survey that I've started with, my daughter's one, is very much about this. Each and everyone has said that what they missed while they were climbing in their career was more of a mentoring, and they are ready now to offer this. As successful women, they are ready to offer this. This is in demand. Yeah, this is what I'm saying. More of a solidarity. Yeah, I believe there should be more of a solidarity. Somehow bring them around yourself, work with them, train them, show what you do. Because, yes, they are, as Despina said, a new generation which might come with completely different models and understandings of society. Great for us, that's real life. But this is what they might be in need for. Yeah, this kind of a solidarity, to be mentored, to be supported, to be guided, to work with someone who has already achieved another woman in a position of power, whatever it means. Thank you very much to each and everyone. Thanks a lot.